Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to talk of a myriad of activities and issues ranging from economic justice to racial injustice. My guest today is an expert on these topics. Sonali Kolhatkar is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, writer, and author. She is the founder, host, and executive producer of Rising Up with Sonali, which airs as a radio program on KPFK, on dozens of community radio stations around the U.S., and as a TV show on free speech television. In addition to her journalistic and political work, Sonali is a prolific artist, and she has won various awards. She's a published author of several books, as well as being a talented singer and songwriter. Sonali Kolhatkar, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. My first question is, how do you find time to do all this stuff? I mean, my
Um,
gosh.
Art is therapy for me. As a journalist, I'm sure
Uh,
you can relate. We're so sort of consumed with all of the things that are happening in the world, and
uh,
so in order to try to cleanse my mind, I do a lot of art, and yeah, I stay busy. I like to stay busy.
Very good. Well, we have to seek a lot of safe areas during
Exactly.
this traumatic period. Well, great. Well, let's jump right into it. We're going to talk about all those issues I mentioned, but let's talk a minute or so on how did you get into independent journalism, doing public service work, and that type of thing?
Well, my background is in physics and astronomy. I'm a scientist by training. I got my master's in astrophysics from the University of Hawaii. And I was working at Caltech as an applications manager. And I quit because I didn't feel like the work was meaningful enough. I wanted to do something more meaningful. I worked specifically with Afghan women in the early 2000s, feminists who were doing some incredible work of, trying to secure their country. And I started a nonprofit. And then a friend suggested I should maybe try my hand at radio because she had heard me give a talk about Afghanistan. And she thought that I was well spoken, was able to express myself. I thought it was quite funny at the time to even consider being a journalist. But then I threw my hat in the ring, and a local radio station hired me. And I haven't looked back since. I found my true calling and then, expanded to television, etc.
Very good. No rear view mirror on this one.
Yeah, I
Just
actually tell the
keep going.
story in great detail in a TEDx talk. So if people want to look up
Uh,
my name with TEDx, they can see the whole story.
okay, very good. Right. And they can also catch your TV show where I see it's on free speech television. And
Yes.
I might just put in, we're going to talk about the media in a minute, but www.freespeech.org is a great source of getting more unbiased, what I call unbiased information, as opposed to some of the mainstream media outlets and what have you. So if our viewers are interested, they can tap into that. You catch, well, you get a variety of people like Stephanie Miller, Tom Hartman, Rick Smith, your show, The Belly of the Beast, talking about Cuba and what's going on, what's actually going on in Cuba, not what's being reported
Yeah.
by the American media in Cuba. So if anybody's interested, be sure and tap into freespeech.org. Well, let's jump into this. And there's so many topics that you could talk about, but let's just take probably one of the hardest ones at first and talk about racial justice or racial injustice. We know that there's an immense amount of racism. Maybe there's a little bit of racism in every country. There's quite a bit in the United States. How do you view this issue, and what are the main components of racial justice?
Well, I think the main thing for people to think about when we look at the country today is that there's links to the past, right? The formation, the origins of this nation built on mass enslavement, built on colonization and dispossession of Indigenous Americans. And that history was never reckoned with, right? South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the United States, we never reckoned with it. We tried to suppress the past. And we talk about this country as a land of opportunity, but that only works if everybody's on a level playing field. And so communities of color, whether they're African Americans, Indigenous people, and even immigrants who have been excluded in various waves, have never been allowed to fully thrive as communities. So they've always started out behind, which has ended up in all of these systemic institutional injustices where you see people of color behind on access to housing, education, employment, high rates of incarceration. And that's where policing comes in. I wrote a book about police abolition last year. And when you start to see how racial injustice is linked to policing, you also realize that it's linked to the economy, because in order to enforce economic inequality, we have to have cops, because otherwise, if we actually put money into things keeping us safe, you would have less crime and you wouldn't need as many cops. And so you have this disproportionate incarceration of people of color. And we also have the leaving out of people of color from our media, from television, Hollywood, newspaper, news media, the narratives we put forward about race and racism and racial differences don't foster equality. I wrote about this in my 2023 book, Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice. And I challenge, Hollywood to do better. I challenge our news media to do better. We have great inequality in our newsrooms and in the writers' rooms. And those are the kinds of things that we need to address and think about. When we see racial injustice on screen, we see it in our cities with policing, we see it in the history of this country, and we see it these days, of course, coming from the mouths of top politicians, referring to immigrants as poisoning the blood of this nation, people from Somalia as being low IQ, et cetera, and all these horrible racist things.
Mm-hmm. Very true. When you said Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you jogged my memory. Nelson Mandela was very instrumental in setting this up. And instead of seeking retribution when he got off of Robbins Island, being in prison for many years, he took this approach, which is very good. A lot of people are suggesting, this just banter right now, that once the Trump administration's gone, that we may need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here, because so many of their people are trying to rewrite history. They're trying to eliminate history, to be quite honest. Saying some of these people are saying slavery was a good thing. It gave people opportunities. Yeah, yeah, right.
I
Great
agree.
employment opportunities. But do you think America should consider that?
I think absolutely it should. And, this is a process that has already started in communities of color. Remember all of the tearing down of the Confederate statues and cities realizing that, they should actually do that. When political leaders take the cue from grassroots organizers, you often see that bottom-up organizing leading to the kind of reconciliation we need. So, making sure that we have proper history education, which we had started to see with things like, they call it critical race theory, but really it's just accurate history teaching in schools, ethnic studies courses in schools, all of these attempts to have a reckoning with the past that are seeing institutional pushback from the government, those need to go forward, and maybe in a more formalized way. We do need to contend with what has happened during the 2 Trump administrations, 1.5 right now. But when this administration is over, the damage that was done to the national psyche, I think it's going to take years for us to recover. And if we don't recover from it, if we don't acknowledge it, it leaves the door open for more people like Trump to keep taking his place. And we can't afford that.
No, it's very true. Well, now, one other group you mentioned were the police and what can be done. Now, so many cases, you have some police that are very dedicated, they're well trained, they follow the rules, that type of thing. You've got some rogue cops who don't. And then, of course, we've got ICE, which doesn't seem to abide by any laws except whatever laws they deem doable at that particular point in time. How should we deal with police and with the ICE agents? I don't want to lump them together because they're not, I don't think they're quite there together, but there's still two potential problems.
Yeah, I do actually put them in largely the same bucket, in large part because the enforcement of laws has never been equal. So when we look at ICE, for example, we were told that ICE was just there to find immigrants who had committed crimes and kick them out. And we know that that's not true. It's much broader than that. And the same thing with police. Police don't actually, first of all, police never stop crime. They don't prevent crime. They address crime after it's been committed. And they often apply their enforcement in very discriminatory ways. And the reason why I think policing is in such crisis is because the incentive is there to abuse and exploit power rather than not. We have qualified immunity for police, which basically gives them the message they can do whatever they want and they're not going to be held accountable. We have over and over again city budgets pouring more money into policing than into things that actually reduce crime. What reduces crime? Jobs, good jobs that are paid well, education, after school programs, all of those things are correlated with low crime. And we keep taking money out of those and putting them into policing. And we keep telling police, and society keeps convincing itself that real safety comes from policing. But for whom, right? If you're a white person in America, you may actually feel safe around a cop. But if you're a person of color, and particularly a Black person in America, the cop is more likely to hurt you than anybody else. And so we have to really ask ourselves, why is that? And what can we do to change it? And what's really exciting is that there are cities around the country that are engaging in abolition. And by that, I don't mean getting rid of police departments entirely, or even starting to. I mean, divesting bit by bit from policing and putting it into the things that truly keep us safe. And one of the main things that starts with is non-police alternatives to mental health crises. We're seeing that play out in New York City, for example, with Zohran Mamdani, the New York City mayor, who was an abolitionist at one point. Now he's trying to play both sides because he realizes it's not good to like straight up come out and say you're against the police. But he's putting money into an office of community safety. So people, when they're having a mental health crisis, can call 911. And instead of getting armed cops, they would get an unarmed, trained mental health professional. And that would be safe for everybody. So those are the kinds of things that we need to think about when we think about policing.
There are so many programs that we could invest in, which we are not. We're actually pulling money, as you mentioned, from these programs that would really make us a much safer society. Well, we're going to come back in just a minute and talk about income inequality and some other issues that are of great importance to the people in the United States and worldwide, I might mention. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a myriad of issues that are of great importance to the people in the United States and around the world, and we're focusing on racial justice, income inequality, and a few others. My guest today is an expert on these topics. Sonali Kolhatkar is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, writer, and author. She is the founder, host, and executive producer of Rising Up with Sonali. Sonali, let's focus on income inequality. Well, before we run out of time here, how do you view that? How do you economic justice, income inequality, if you want to merge them? How do you view that, and what can we do to make it much more equitable in this country? Years ago, we used to look at South America and say, oh, look at the Latin American countries. Look how the income inequality is creating the haves, the small haves, and a lot of have-nots. Now we're saying it about the United States. What can we do? Well, first off, what's the situation and what can we do?
I think people everywhere today, if you're not in the 1%, you're feeling it. You're feeling it in your pocketbook. Gas prices rising, food inflation rising, housing still out of control, wages not rising fast enough. And now with the new so-called big, beautiful bill, you're seeing the wealthy people, the wealthiest people and corporations getting even fewer taxes taken out. And you're seeing the defunding of Medicaid, SNAP program, which is a food stamps program. So people are getting squeezed from every direction. And even if the stock market may be booming, that's not an actual measure of how insecure people are financially. Now, all of these insecurities and economic insecurities also fall along racial lines, just because of what we were talking about before the break, where those inequities that were built into the system from the start have never been truly addressed. People of color have never been on a level playing field because of historic disadvantages that they were never allowed to or never given any kind of compensation for. And so you see greater insecurity financially among communities of color. And what we need to do about it is very simple. If we have a highly unequal society, we have to find a way to pump money from the top into the bottom. And there's many ways to do it. Just one example, I was talking on my program today about the state of Washington that passed a new law to tax millionaires 9.9% over the first $1 million they make. And that goes hand in hand in that same bill with family tax credits. So the lowest 20%, who are taxed at a higher rate right now, which is kind of unimaginable, the lowest 20% get some tax credits back. And so everywhere around the country, Massachusetts now has a millionaire's tax. We need to raise taxes on the rich, and we need to pump that money into making life easier on the rest of us, improving our education. Why do we not have government-funded healthcare? Just Medicare for all would solve so many problems. Workers wouldn't be tied to their jobs. Most people, their financial insecurity today comes from medical bankruptcy. They're one hospitalization away from full-blown bankruptcy. If we had Medicare for all, which would be cheaper for everybody, we'd solve a whole host of issues. So there are so many solutions to income inequality, and we are not enacting them fast enough. But we need to do that in order for us to survive. And frankly, I think it's really important for rich people to acknowledge income inequality doesn't benefit them either. To live in a society where there are so many people who are struggling means that your society starts to break down. You have increasing crime, your cultural institutions aren't as well attended or enjoyed, your arts and your job markets are not vibrant, your cityscapes are not vibrant. It is dystopian to live the way we're living, including today for the wealthiest among us. So that has to change, and the solutions are really obvious.
They certainly are, but we seem to be doing the opposite right now, and that's the problem. Well, if you think back, or we read our history books or whatever, and look back at the 50s and 60s, we had a very vibrant middle class in this country. And one of the main reasons was because we had strong labor unions. Those unions have been gutted right now. Several administrations have tried to gut them, especially the most recent one. But how important is it to have strong labor unions? And again, realizing that labor doesn't always get it right. There's some things you can change to make it more equitable. But how important is it to have strong labor unions so that you do have a middle class that has purchasing power, that you can go out and buy homes, refrigerators, cars, whatever the case might be?
It's so hugely important. We have such a tiny sliver of the workforce that's unionized today. The good news is it's growing. Last year, something like 500,000 more Americans joined unions, and that's just a tiny fraction of those who want to join unions. The desire among people wanting to join unions is huge, and you can look up this information. Pew Research has some great information on that. Unions are very popular among Americans, and there's a lot of research very clearly documenting the obvious, which is that union membership is correlated with higher wages and better benefits. Just earlier this year, in January and February, I covered the nurses' strikes. There were twin nurses' strikes from different nurses' unions happening on both coasts. In the East Coast, in New York City, and the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Hawaii, you had these massive nurses' strikes where tens of thousands of nurses and nurse professionals, historic numbers of them, went on strike, and they held out in grim winter months, and they won. And so, yes, unions are such an important, and the labor movement is such an important way forward out of our income inequality crisis. And again, as you were saying, the government has not made it very easy. They've gutted the ability of people to be able to unionize. They've gutted the National Labor Relations Board, hampered it. Under Biden, we saw some progress. And then, of course, Trump has come in and really laid waste to the NLRB. We need unions. And this country loves unions. The people, I should say, of this country loves unions.
That's very true. They certainly do. And if we look back also, one of the main problems we have today, there's so many myths that are out there. And one is this trickle-down theory that came out of really about the Reagan administration. And we've all bought into it. Well, if we give money to the wealthy, they'll create jobs. That's not true. What they're doing is buying back their stock, playing the stock market, getting that fourth yacht, getting their 15th home in some developing country or whatever the case might be. But this trickle-down theory is just It has not worked, but it's now they're trying to incorporate it into many of the business schools, into the universities, probably into high schools. It is really a myth, is it not?
Absolutely. And even Joe Biden, who is not by any means even close to being some kind of raging leftist socialist, during his second term or when he was campaigning for his second term, said trickle down economics doesn't work. We know that. And it's good that mainstream politicians are now finally admitting something that the left has been saying right from the start, which is that if you actually care about the well-being of ordinary people, why would you put money into the pockets of everybody else, into the pockets of the wealthy, and expect it to trickle down? In fact, often money trickles up, right? And in general, it has been trickling up. But if we want money to spread the most equitably, you put it into the hands of the ones who have the least, because they don't have they're not going to use it as disposable income or hoard it. They're going to be spending it on the things they desperately need, and that's going to move through the economy and benefit everybody else. If you pump money directly into the bottom 20% of society, that benefits everybody. And it's completely opposite to that, as you were saying, that kind of standard myth. And we need to change the way business schools teach Americans. I think a lot of people are realizing there's a huge popularity of socialist ideas among young people today. And we're seeing socialist leaders being elected. And, not just New York City, but the new mayor of Seattle is a self-declared socialist. The mayor of Boston, Massachusetts is someone who's been associated with socialists. We have people who are running for office for LA mayor who openly identify as socialists, that we didn't used to have that kind of thing before. So I think times are changing and people's ideas are changing.
Very true. And then, of course, in this country, we found with this administration, if you say something or you're against one of their ideas, they call you a socialist or a communist or whatever the case might be, which is total nonsense. And socialism is not communism from
Yeah.
the old USSR. It's not even close. When I hear socialism, democratic socialism, I think of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Those are the ones that have thriving businesses. They have a high standard of living, and they're doing very well, but they do tax the wealthy. And in this country, back during the Eisenhower administration, who was a Republican, by the way, we were taxing, I think, 95% of your earnings above a certain amount. And today you hear the wealthy crying and moaning and groaning about paying a little bit more, and they're paying far less than they would have paid back then. Well, we're about to run out of time. Before we do, let me ask you, you've grown up in you were in the Middle East, I think in the
Yeah.
United Arab Emirates. Did you not grow up there?
I
And
did.
so you've come into contact with many types of journalists and publications and media outlets. How do you perceive those as far as providing factual information, more unbiased than most, as opposed to the American coverage?
If you want to get accurate coverage of the Middle East, read Al Jazeera. If you want to get accurate coverage of the United States, read the BBC News or CNBC, which is the Canadian. You can read the Canadian broadcasting system. There are, unfortunately, foreign media outlets these days do a much better job because they're less incentivized by ads, by corporate shareholders, by creating profit. And I think whenever you tie journalism, which is sharing information in order to have a thriving democracy, whenever you tie that to the making of profit, it perverts it, it subverts it, it undermines it. And we see the end result of that now with greater and greater media consolidation and these companies more interested in the bottom line than in spreading truth and information. So I think if people really, and so many Americans are skeptical of the media, they trust the media as little as they trust politicians these days, which is saying so much. So people are getting their information increasingly from independent media. The problem is independent media is struggling to get funding. So I really want to end on asking your viewers to really think about, in your charitable donations that you make to organizations, how many of them are independent media outlets? Consider adding independent media outlets to the groups that you support and financially sustain. Our democracy is depending on it.
It certainly is. There's no doubt about it. And we have to improve. And it's really just, well, it's dismaying to watch these ultra rich people who have gotten tax breaks. They basically bribe members of Congress to draft laws that are favorable to them so they can keep more of their money. But for them to buy up all of our, not all, but a large part of our media outlets and to put this right wing propaganda on, which is all it is, we can see well, we know what Fox is. We don't even have to talk about them. They're so far out of it. And some of the others, Onan and different ones like that. But it's important that the people get involved and become engaged and learn more about this. But we've got to improve the situation. But Sonali Kolhatkar, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.